In 1978, Italy did something no country had done before. It passed a law that ordered every asylum in the nation closed, the locks taken off, the patients let out. Across Europe, the great institutions followed, emptied ward by ward through the 80s and 90s until the corridors fell silent. So why, decades later, do the buildings still hold the evidence of what was done inside them? We found 10 of them. Stay to number 1, the asylum at Volterra, where one man spent years carving a book onto a stone wall, using nothing but the buckle of his belt. Number 10, the security pavilion at the Miguel Bombarda Hospital, Lisbon, Portugal. If you had stood in the middle of this building when it was running, you could have seen every door at once. That was the point. It is a circle of cells around an open yard, with a watchtower once rising from the centre, built so a single guard could watch every patient at every moment. The hospital began life as a convent called Rilla Foles, and in 1848 it became the first psychiatric hospital in Portugal. The round pavilion came later, finished in 1896. It was modelled on the panopticon, the prison design dreamed up by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham a century before. It was not built for the ordinary patients. It was built for the ones considered dangerous and for men sent across from the Lisbon penitentiary who could not be mixed with the rest. The architect thought of everything. He rounded off the edges of the benches and the doorways and smoothed every corner so that a patient could find nothing sharp to hurt himself with. It is a small detail, and it tells you exactly what kind of place this was. The pavilion took patients until the year 2000, and the wider hospital closed in 2011. The tower in the middle is gone now, replaced by trees, and the cells stand open around a quiet green yard. There is a terrible irony in the name. Dr. Miguel Bombarda, the reformer who ran this hospital, was shot dead inside it in 1910 by one of his own patients, a building made to watch everyone, and it could not see that coming. Number 9, Lier Hospital, near Drammen, Norway. The blocks sit in the forest south of Oslo. Long, pale buildings with rows of identical windows, the paint peeling, the beds still in some of the rooms. A working hospital runs on part of the grounds to this day. The rest was left. Lier opened in the 1920s as a county asylum. For its first decades, it did what these places did, holding hundreds of chronic patients nobody else would take. But in the late 1950s and early 60s, something else began here. This was the era when psychiatry fell in love with the new chemicals, and Lier became the Norwegian hospital that used them most freely. Patients were given LSD, mescaline and other drugs, dose after dose, as doctors chased the idea that the right chemical could break a mind, open and rebuild it. The experiments were written up in seminars and journals at the time. What is harder to find is any sign that the patients on the receiving end were ever asked. By the time the drugs were outlawed in Norway in 1966, the trials had wound down. The wards stayed open for decades more and only later emptied. Today, the abandoned blocks are among the most photographed ruins in Scandinavia. People come for the long corridors and the rusting beds and the chairs left exactly where they stood. What none of the photographs can tell you is how many of the people treated here ever understood what was being done to them. Number 8. The North Wales Hospital in Denbigh, Wales. A vast Victorian building of grey limestone, towers and wings spreading across the hillside above the town. The windows are smashed, the floors are falling in, and it has been set on fire more than once. It is still somehow standing. It opened in 1848, the first asylum built in Wales, and it was built for a reason that is almost touching. Welsh patients had been sent away to asylums in England, where they sat among strangers, unable to speak a word of the language around them. Denbigh was meant to be a place where they could at least be understood. That was the intention. What followed was the usual story. Built for 200, it held 1,500 by the 1950s. Overcrowded, understaffed, and in some years swept by typhoid and influenza. And then there were the treatments. Electric shock therapy arrived here in 1941, given at first with no anaesthetic at all, until patients began breaking and dislocating their own limbs in the convulsions. The lobotomy followed a year later. 24 patients were operated on. One of them died. Here is the detail that rarely gets told. The same hospital built, so that frightened people could be spoken to in their own language, became a place where some of them were silenced for good. The last patient left in 1995, after 147 years. The buildings have been crumbling ever since, passed from owner to owner, too listed to demolish and too ruined to save. Number 7. Severals Hospital in Colchester, England. 13 miles of corridor once ran through this place, so long that the nurses rode bicycles down them. 2,000 patients lived here at its peak, in a sprawl of red brick and water towers north of the town. It opened in 1913, and like most asylums of its day, it admitted people for reasons that would horrify us now. Women were sent here by their own families for having a child outside marriage or for being assaulted, and once inside, many of them never left. Then came the night of the 11th of August, 1942. A German bomber, thought to have mistaken the huge complex for a factory, dropped a stick of 500-pound bombs across the western wards. 3 of them struck home, hitting a women's ward, the nurses' quarters and the laundry, while the hospital slept. 38 patients were killed, almost all of them women, many of them elderly. A 21-year-old nurse named Muriel Jackson went into the wreckage with nothing but a torch and led the doctors to the survivors. If you are finding these worth your time, take a second to subscribe, because there is a video like this for every corner of Europe. And the next 4 places are the hardest of all. The one waiting at number 1 is the strangest thing I have ever put in a list. The dead were buried together in Colchester Cemetery, under stones that now read simply Air Raid Casualty. Severals carried on after the war, through the lobotomy years and the long decline, until it finally closed in 1997. Number 6. Whittingham Hospital in Lancashire, England. At its height, this was the largest mental hospital in Britain, a town in its own right, with a railway, a brewery, a ballroom and a brass band. More than 3,500 patients lived here in 1939. It pioneered the brain-scanning technology we still use today, and behind all of it, on 4 wards in a single division, something rotten had taken hold. In 1967, a group of student nurses did something brave. They wrote down what they had seen and handed it to their tutor. Patients were dragged across the floor by their hair. They were punched, locked in a cupboard under the stairs, and left outside in all weathers. One had a wet towel twisted around the neck until they passed out. For their trouble, the students were threatened with libel. Nobody listened, and the complaints were buried for another year. It took until 1972 for the government to act. The Payne Inquiry laid it all out in a report that still makes hard reading, finding cruelty, bad practice and fraud. One patient had died as a result of ill treatment. Whittingham did not survive the scandal by much. The reforms it triggered helped empty asylums across the country, and the hospital itself closed in 1995. Most of it has since been knocked down for housing. The brass band, the ballroom, the railway, all gone. What it is remembered for is 4 wards and a wet towel. Number 5. Mombello, near Lier, north of Milan, Italy. Behind a wall 2 meters high and 3 kilometers long stands the largest asylum Italy ever built. 40,000 square meters of wards and cells and corridors, set in the grounds of a villa where Napoleon once stayed. It opened in the 1870s. It was built for 600 patients. At its worst, it held more than 3,000, sorted by the staff into crude categories: the calm, the agitated, the filthy, the workers. Among those 3,000 was a young man whose story takes a turn nobody expects. His name was Benito Albino, and he was the son of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini had a child with a woman called Ida Dalsa, then rose to power and decided that child no longer existed. The mother was locked in an asylum and died there. The boy was given a new surname, watched, and eventually shut away here at Mombello. He died inside these walls in 1942, aged 26. The clinical records that survive describe repeated injections of insulin that put him into coma after coma until his body gave out. An Italian newspaper later called it a crime of the regime. The asylum closed under the 1978 law and emptied at the end of the century. The pavilions are wrecked now, the floors carpeted with thousands of abandoned patient files, names and diagnoses scattered in the damp. Somewhere in all that paper, once, was the file of a dictator's son nobody was allowed to remember. Number 4. Hadamar, in Hesse, Germany. On a hill above a small town stands a plain institutional building that is still today a working psychiatric hospital. There is a memorial inside it. There has to be. In the winter of 1941, this was one of 6 places the Nazi state turned into a killing centre for its own disabled and mentally ill citizens, under the programme later known by the code Action T4. Patients arrived by the busload, grey buses with painted-over windows. They were taken inside, told to undress for a medical examination, and led down into a room in the cellar that had been built as a gas chamber. Between January and August of that year, 10,072 people were murdered here. The smoke from the crematorium hung over the town. The local children knew exactly what the buses were and shouted it at each other in the street. Almost none of this was supposed to be known. The families received letters inventing a cause of death and an urn that did not hold their relative. When public protest forced the gassings to stop, Hadamar simply changed its methods. In a second phase, it went on killing quietly, with overdoses and starvation for years. Around 4,500 more died. American soldiers reached it in 1945 and filmed what they found. The trial that followed was the first of its kind. The hospital treats patients to this day. It is, I think, the only honest thing it could do to keep working with the names of the dead on the wall. Number 3, the Leros Asylum on the Greek island of Leros in the Aegean. For most of the 20th century, Leros was where the Greek mainland sent the patients it wanted to forget. The hospital opened in 1958 in old Italian military barracks, and over the years it filled with thousands of people shipped out from overcrowded asylums and simply left. For a long time, nobody outside looked. Then in 1989, 2 journalists from a British newspaper got inside, and what they published stopped Europe cold. The article was called Europe's Guilty Secret. The photographs showed grown men, naked, malnourished, tied up or huddled on the bare floors of the wards. People described conditions out of a concentration camp on a sunlit Greek island, paid for in part with European money. This was not wartime. This was not a dictatorship. This was 1989 in a member state of the European community, and the cruelty was simply administrative. Patients warehoused, untrained locals hired as guards, the whole island economy built on the institution. Remember the question this video started with? Why do the empty buildings still hold the evidence? Leros is the answer in its rawest form. The wards still stand, half-ruined, beside a refugee camp that now occupies the same ground. The scandal forced reform at last. The worst wards were closed, and the patients were slowly given back something like a life. A couple of hundred remain, in gentler buildings nearby. The journalist who broke the story heard one line he never forgot. In ancient Greece, the entrance to the underworld was a cave. In modern Greece, a delegate told him, it was on Leros. Number 2. Am Spiegelgrund in Vienna, Austria. The buildings are beautiful, which is the worst part. They sit on a green hillside on the edge of the city, pavilions arranged around a famous Art Nouveau church, a place that was meant to heal. Between 1940 and 1945, one of those pavilions was a clinic where the Nazi state murdered children. Children judged disabled, or difficult, or simply unwanted. 789 of them. They were killed slowly, to make it look like illness. Overdoses of sedative, deliberate starvation, cold. And before and after they died, their brains were removed and kept in jars for research. Here is the part that should not be possible. One of the doctors, Heinrich Gross, kept that collection of children's brains for decades after the war. He built a respected career on it. He published papers. He was never convicted. The jars sat in a basement in Vienna until almost the end of the century. In April of 2002, the remains were finally brought out and buried. 600 urns. A funeral, 57 years late, for children whose only crime was being thought imperfect. The names of all 789 are carved now on stone at the site. There is an exhibition. There are a few survivors who live to tell it. A place built as a hospital, on a beautiful hill, with a beautiful church. And in its cellar, for the best part of a century, the evidence waited. Number 1. The Asylum at Volterra in Tuscany, Italy. After everything you have just seen, this one is different. There is no gas chamber here, no scandal, no inquiry. There is a wall. The hospital at Volterra opened in 1888 and grew into one of the largest in Italy, a walled city of pavilions on a Tuscan hilltop. It had its own currency, its own farms, its own everything, a closed world the patients rarely left. The regime inside was hard, the wards could be caged, and the treatments were of their time. In 1958, a man named Fernando Oreste Nanetti was sent here. He was in his early 30s, diagnosed as schizophrenic, a quiet man who believed he received signals from the stars, who called himself an astral colonel and signed his name as a code, NOF4, the 4 being the number of his ward. He had no paper, or none they would give him. He had no pungaman. What he had was the metal buckle from the strap of his uniform. So he began to write on the wall. In the courtyard of the ferry pavilion, day after day, year after year, Nanetti scratched an enormous text into the plaster with that buckle. He drew a frame like a page and filled it, then drew the next. Across more than a decade, he covered something close to 180 meters of wall, 2 meters high, with a single unbroken work. It is a book carved in stone. An encyclopedia of his own invented universe, full of airwaves and metals and spacecraft and saints, written in hard, angular letters that look almost Etruscan. Psychiatrists, linguists, and artists have spent years trying to read it. Nobody fully can. Nanetti was moved on in 1973 and died in 1994. The asylum closed under the Great Reform Law of 1978 and was handed over to the weather. Today, only about 40 of those 180 meters survive. The plaster is flaking off the wall and taking his words with it, and a small group of people are trying against the clock to save what is left. Think about what that wall is. A man the world had shut away, locked in a place designed to silence him, who refused to be silent, who used the only tool he had, the buckle off his own clothes, to write himself into existence on the one surface they could not take from him. He had no voice they would listen to, so he wrote a book on a wall, and made them look. 10 asylums across 8 countries and most of a century. Some of them were places of murder. Some were places of neglect so deep it took a newspaper to end it. Most were simply places where frightened people were put away and forgotten, in the confident belief that it was kindness. The buildings outlived the certainty. That is why they still hold the evidence. Italy started pulling the locks off in 1978, and one by one the rest of Europe followed, and the great institutions fell quiet. But quiet is not the same as gone. I keep coming back to Nanetti and his buckle and his wall. Everyone else in this video was, in the end, defined by what was done to them. He is the one who answered back. He had no power, no freedom, no pen, and not much of a mind left that the world recognized, and he still left behind 180 meters of himself. 40 of those meters are still there for now. If you would like to come with us to the next 10 places Europe would rather forget, subscribe, and we will keep walking the perimeter fences together. Thank you.